What are alien species? Species that have been introduced are moved by human activation to a location where they do not naturally occur. So what are keystone species? Species on which other species in an ecosystem largely depend such that if it were removed, the ecosystem would change drastically. Name the hotspots of India, Western Ghat and Sri Lanka, Eastern Himalaya and Indo-Burma and Himalaya. Hi everyone, welcome back to yet another revision class of 2nd PUC Biology, Chapter 15 called Biodiversity and Conservation. By seeing this picture itself, you can understand how important this biodiversity is, and it's our bound responsibility to conserve and preserve this precious biodiversity. What is the weightage of marks for this particular chapter? The weightage of marks for this particular chapter is 4 marks. So what will be the distribution of marks for this particular chapter called Biodiversity and Conservation? 4 marks, that is 2 marker question, that is 2 questions, or it might be 1 plus 1 also. So we must understand even 1 marker question and 2 marker questions also. So the weightage of marks for this particular chapter is how much? 4 marks, 2 marker question, 2 questions, which may also appear as split questions like 1 plus 1. Now let us understand about the chapter introduction. The very word itself we understand. Bio means what? Living, diversified. We come across diversified plants and animals existing on this planet Earth. So how do we define the word called biodiversity? The biodiversity can be defined as what? The sum total of species richness. This is one type of definition. What will be the other definition for the same word called biodiversity? The term biodiversity refers to the totality of species and ecosystem of a region. So how can we define? We can define biodiversity like it is a sum total of species richness, or the term biodiversity refers to the totality of gene species and ecosystem of a region. So what is the very important aim of conservation of this important biodiversity? It is very important for us to protect, preserve and manage the natural resources. So it's very important for us to conserve and preserve the biodiversity. So what are the types of biodiversity which is described by Edward Wilson? We have genetic diversity, that is the variety of the variability of genes that occur in a species. Then the species diversity and the ecological diversity, which is also called as what? Habitat diversity. So in the synopsis, we'll study about the levels of biodiversity. That is, we have different 3 types of biodiversity. That is the genetic diversity, species diversity and ecological diversity, and the global species diversity. Patterns of biodiversity. We have latitudinal gradients, species area relationship, and the importance of species diversity to the ecosystem. All these are the important concepts what you are going to study in this particular chapter called Biodiversity and Conservation. So what are the benefits of the biodiversity? In what terms we are benefited? Like narrow utilitarian benefits or broad utilitarian benefits, and types of conservation. We have in situ conservation and ex situ conservation. In situ conservation, conserving the plants and animals in their natural habitat, whereas in ex situ conservation, like in situ conservation, we come across the national parks, then we have the sanctuaries, all that comes under wildlife sanctuary, all those come under in situ conservation. But whereas in case of ex situ conservation, they are taken out from the natural habitat and they have given protection, and a natural habitat is set up under human protection. So and the international efforts of conserving biodiversity is also discussed in this particular chapter called Biodiversity and Conservation. Moving on, as I said, what will be the type of questions asked? As I said, the weightage of marks for this particular question is 4 marks, like 2 marker question, you'll get 2 questions. But as I said, even in 2 marker question, you may have a split question for 1 plus 1. So let us understand what might be the 1 marker question. Write a scientific name of the plant that yield reserpine. That is Rolfia vomitoria, which is a medicinal plant grown in the Himalayas, where an alkaloid called reserpine is extracted from this Rolfia vomitoria. Expand IUCN, International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources. What are alien species? Species that have been introduced are moved by human activation to a location where they do not naturally occur is called as alien species. You can give a good number of examples for alien species like the Parthenium, that is the carrot grass, and water hyacinth, that is Iconia. They have become alien species and they prove a threat to the indigenous species. Then name the two types of biodiversity conservation, that is in situ conservation and ex situ conservation. You protect the plants and animals in their natural habitat. It's called in situ. Ex situ, we take out the plants and animals from their natural habitat and they are given protection under human care. So example for in situ is national parks you can give, and ex situ conservation you can give zoo, etc., botanical garden, zoo, etc. Next, what are keystone species? Species on which other species in an ecosystem largely depend such that if it were removed, the ecosystem would change drastically. So what are keystone species? Species on which other species in an ecosystem largely depend such that if it were removed, the ecosystem would change drastically. Next, what are the major causes of loss of biodiversity? So this is a very common question which is asked in the examination, right? Habitat loss and fragmentation, overexploitation, alien species invasion and co-extinction. Usually this might be asked for 2-marker question. Right, next, give examples for extinct species. Like we have dodo, that is the bird from Mauritius, then quagga, that is zebra-like animal from Africa, thylacine, that is the marsupial, then Stella's sea cow from Russia, and 3 subspecies of tiger, that is Bali, Javan and Caspian. Next, for 2-marker question, according to Robert May, what is the estimate global species diversity? About 7 million in the estimate global species diversity. Of these 7 million, more than 70% of species are animals and only 22% species are plants and fungi. Among the animals, 70% of species are insects. As we know, insects dominate. We find them in more number compared to other animals. Next, name the hotspots of India, Western Ghat and Sri Lanka, Eastern Himalaya, and Indo-Burma and Himalaya. Next, when and where World Summit on Sustainable Development held? How many countries signed the communication? So, held in Johannesburg, that is South Africa in 2002, 190 countries signed to reduce the current rate of biodiversity loss. So, these are the type of questions that might be asked from this particular chapter called Biodiversity and Conservation, which is having a weightage of 4 marks. Now, what are the learning outcomes? At the end of this chapter, what are you all going to learn? What are the important concepts you all are going to learn from this particular chapter? Define biodiversity, as I already said, diversity at all levels of biological organization. Describe the patterns of biodiversity. Explain the species area relationship. Mention the importance of species diversity to ecosystem functioning. Enumerate the causes and effect of loss of biodiversity like habitat loss, fragmentation, overexploitation, alien species invasion, all that. Explain the 3 kinds of arguments, that is, as already said, narrow utilitarian, broad utilitarian, and the third one that is called ethical. Next, describe the 2 major approaches, that is in situ and ex situ, for conservation of biodiversity with examples. Define endemism, hotspot and cryopreservation. Describe the conventions on biological diversity. All these are the important concepts what you are going to learn at the end of this particular chapter called Biodiversity and Conservation. So moving on to a brief recap of this particular chapter with a flow chart. So biodiversity and its conservation. Different levels of biodiversity, as already discussed: genetic diversity, species diversity and ecological diversity. E will quoted what are the 4 important causes for loss of biodiversity, which is called habitat loss and fragmentation, overexploitation, alien species invasion and co-extinction. Then patterns of biodiversity and that is conserving bio. What are the patterns of biodiversity? We have latitudinal gradients and species area relationship. Reasons for conserving biodiversity, as already said, narrow utilitarian, broadly utilitarian and ethical argument. Right. Next, different methods to conserve biodiversity. Methods to conserve biodiversity, that is in situ and ex situ. What are the examples? So what is in situ? The natural, it's in a natural habitat. They are protected in a natural habitat. So like we have the biodiversity hotspots, we have biodiversity, biosphere reserves, national parks and sacred groves. Like ex situ conservation, gamete protect, like we have gene bank, seed bank, tissue culture and cryopreservation. Then we have ex situ, we have botanical garden, zoological park and wildlife safari park. Hope you all have understood the important concepts of this particular chapter called biodiversity and conservation from examination point of view, which had this particular chapter which had a weightage of 4 marks. Thank you.